So welcome, Sean Hancock. Sean is the minister at Hope United Church, our neighbor, almost our next door neighbor, very nearby. And I'm just delighted and honored to have Sean, who is not only a colleague but also a friend of mine, to have him as our first summer guest this morning. And the text he picked, as it was the text we just read this morning, the 139th Psalm. And of course, my first question to you, Sean, is why that particular psalm?
I chose that particular psalm for a number of reasons. Why it speaks very deeply to me in a very personal way. That I have often gone through periods in my life where I have felt alone or distant, and says from others, as if I am not known or I'm not heard by the people around me. And this speaks very closely to me in the sense that it reminds me that I am in God's presence at all times, that I am never alone, and that I am understood, even the parts of me that I don't understand, and says are understood by God. And I find that a very reassuring thing.
I can see that, yes. It also happens to be one of my go-to places, and I've for similar reasons. And I think that in a time of pandemic, it might even be more appropriate for resonate with a lot of people, even more people than usually. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly agree with you. And says right now, due to COVID-19, that we're doing a lot of social distancing. And I think in Nova Scotia here, we're only back to 10-person bubbles max. For most of us, and says that's really isolating, that we aren't able to do the activities we typically do. We aren't able to socialize the way we normally would. We're not even allowed to gather in our church buildings to worship right now because it's a health and safety risk. And I think it's good to know right now, when connecting with the 139th Psalm, that even as we are apart, that we are still with God, that there, even if we're in our own homes, even if there's only one or maybe even no other people in our bubble right now because we live alone, that doesn't mean that we are alone, that God is moving through with us in this time, and that, our loneliness, our anxiety, our fear, that these are known to God as well, and that God understands it.
And I'm just thinking of that. I know of some folks who are isolated at home, often two people, and one of them told me that I love my partner, but not every hour of the day. And there's in this psalm, there's this moment where the psalmist says, "I can't get away from you, God." So
Mm.
it's on the one hand, it's beautiful to know, as you just mentioned, but it can also be oppressive. It's hard to deal with that.
Yeah, it's certainly, when you really look at the implications of it, it can be a little intimidating, because most of us, and since we kind of have the self that we put forward to other people, and then we sort of have this secret self, and then even below that, we've got the part of ourselves that even we don't want to talk about or know about. And what the psalm is saying to us is, look, even that part of you is exposed to God. It doesn't matter if you go hide yourself. It doesn't matter if you run to the ends of the earth. It doesn't even matter if you die. That's still going to be known to God, that you are naked in every conceivable way before God. And most of us aren't used to having that kind of intimacy with anyone. So that can be a little intimidating.
Yeah. And maybe the only way of dealing with that is vulnerability, having the courage to open yourself up and say, "This is me. This is it, with all my flaws, with all my potential, and I can't, I cannot. You see through my facades." Just as in a good relationship, is your partner will see after a while will see through you, will see through your facades and uh, and your smart ways of trying to disguise some of your not so wonderful sides. So it is, yeah, you have to be able to show your true self to God, and to be able to live with that, accept that. Not
I think
always
it's,
easy.
I was going to say, I think it's both of those things, that it is, it is being able to trust God in that space, and so to trust God with your nakedness and your vulnerability, and to know that being exposed to God is not a bad thing, that in fact it is a blessing to us, because and so not only does it teach us how to be honest with ourselves, which is very important for our relationship with ourselves, not just with relationships with others, and says, but it also reminds us that, and says, God knows us because God wants to love us. God does love us. That this knowing is for our good. It's not going to be used against us, and says it's not going to be used to manipulate us. It's going to be used to hold and uphold us. This is to help us move forward, to help us lead a better life, to help us be a better person and more comfortable with ourselves and our own skin.
And by extension, I think that that almost automatically leads us to the anti-black protests that are happening in the streets right now. I think that that what you just said extends to that is you are loved by who you are. There are no exceptions. God sees you for whom you have been created. So do you see it applies to how it applies to some of the protests and the ideas behind it?
Well, absolutely. You know, something I've actually been talking about a fair bit in my sermons the last few weeks is about the fact that really all of us are a part of God, that the separations we perceive between each other, whether it's physical distance or skin color or culture, you know, whatever that happens to be, that these are artificial, that they don't really exist, that they're illusions that, you know, help us navigate our world in some ways. And it's just because it needs to make sense to our brain in some ways, but it doesn't really exist in fact. And how can you come and say, I love God, who is in all of us and in all things, and not love our neighbor, and not love, you know, the people across the street, and not love, and says anybody anywhere from any race or culture, because not only are they a part of God, they're a part of us as well. It's like hating a part of yourself. And we do incalculable damage to our own soul and our own humanity when we reject that truth.
And maybe that's that's why the psalm takes this sudden left turn. If you look at, I'm just grabbing my Bible here. Imagine that, a Bible. 2 minutes since we have a Bible here. So if you go to the near the end, verse 19, there's this sudden turn. It's almost from meditative
Mm-hmm.
and thankfulness. It goes to aggression, no, not aggression, assertiveness, and suddenly there's a thrust forward, almost an anger. Oh God, if you only would destroy the wicked, get out of my life, you murderers. They blaspheme you. I think maybe that's how we can see, that's how I see it connects to the others, the folks who are not like us.
Yeah. Well, and says I think what it's driving at is that as much as it can be comforting to know God's love, it should be infuriating to see the absence of God's love, particularly when people do it in the name of God, when they preach hate, when they preach division, when they create barriers between people and they try to divide and separate us, and says that that is something that we absolutely should not be tolerant of, and says that we can't, I guess as the saying goes, we can't be tolerant of intolerance.
Yeah.
And to use the phrase of the psalmist, that in essence that we need to hate that when we see it in the behavior of others, the behavior that is, not hating the other, but hating the behavior.
And I think along similar lines. And as you were saying that, I realized we're seeing this obviously through our own lens, which is a comfortable middle class group of people who sometimes uh, who sometimes paint themselves into a corner or have difficulties dealing with a situation we haven't been before, like the pandemic. But now I'm thinking think of this psalm as seeing through the eyes of the have-nots, the
Mm.
people who have a lot less to lose than we have, and are suffering. How would you, how would those same lines and that anger make sense from that perspective?
Well, Francis, I agree with you that both of us, by virtue of who we happen to be born as, enjoy a great deal of privilege in the world, both in terms of our wealth, our education, and says our race, our maleness
Mm.
in society. That all of these things, and says whether we like it or not, do grant us privileges, and we well, I try. I know I'm sure you do as well. I try very hard to work past those. And says we need to be conscious of the fact that it's kind of like the air we breathe, that
Yeah.
it's a part of us, and it's sometimes hard to see the barriers. Um, I think in terms of how it's fitting into this particular moment, I think that from the positions of those who do not share this privilege, I think that they are rightfully angry. I think that protest, that outrage, that even to a certain extent, and says the rioting is understandable because it's coming from a place where justice has been denied for so long, that these are people who are saying, see me, hear me, understand what you're doing, and help me, and says that we are called upon to do justice and to love kindness, and there isn't any here. And the absence of it is something that all of us should be outraged by. Just because it doesn't affect us directly doesn't mean that it isn't affecting us, because what affects one of us affects all of us. And since we're interconnected, and I guess I kind of like the line that, there's no justice for any of us until there is justice for all of us.
And it might mean that we may have to let go of some of those privileges, which is a tough thing to do.
It's extremely tough. I know I've been looking a little bit at it, and this is a new learning edge for me, but how we can use our privilege to shield others who don't have it, and to amplify their message, and to protect them as they deliver that message, which I think as we move forward is going to be important as well.
Yeah. Any particular groups or people you're thinking of?
There are so many.
Yeah.
And since right now, and says the emphasis on Black Lives Matter, and for very good reason. And says it's hard for me to even wrap my head around the situation that they face on a daily basis, the fear that they have to deal with on a daily basis, and it's fear caused by people who are supposed to be there to serve and protect them. But Canada's not innocent of that either, and says I don't have to look very hard to find instances of it all across the country in newspapers and news reports. And says in Canada also that our track record with our First Nations brothers and sisters is particularly abysmal. I know in the last few years there have been some modest efforts towards reconciliation, but this is only the very beginning. We've more or less just picked up the phone, to begin the conversation. Now we actually have to have that conversation and then walk the walk. And says and keep as we continue to talk with each other. And says, but we deal with the same thing in terms of those who are struggling economically. And says whether we like to think of it this way or not, it's very hard to get off welfare in this country once you go on it, because of the way the system's set up. And for all that the system tries to be as compassionate as possible, it's still very dehumanizing. And you have to check in regularly with people, and you get monitored, and it's not really just. It's not really helping these people get out of those positions. And this is just a few of the things off the top of my head, that it's a huge problem, and it pervades so much.
It can be overwhelming, yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking it is the same sort of virtual dialogue between the psalmist and God, because there's a lot of you and I. This
Mm.
is a God who knows, who not only knows us, but a God who let God's self be known to us.
Mhm.
This is the God who chose the people of Israel, put them out of the bondage. gave us Jesus, gave us the message. All these things that we know God has done.
Mhm.
This is a God who comes to us. It's not us coming to God. It's a God coming to us. So that's why it makes sense, I think, that there's this part in there that I can't run away because wherever I am, God is too, which is good, but also has consequences.
Sure.
So I was thinking of echoes of Job's dialogue in the book
Hmm.
of Job. This is a person who's lost it all, but it has a similar discussion with God, saying, "What's going on here?" And God says, "But I know you. I've made you." What are your thoughts about that?
There's definitely some crossover there that the two passages, are in dialogue with each other. I think it comes down to, I guess, to 2 points. The one is the very personal relationship with God, the being known that this isn't a distant relationship. There's a reason why Jesus uses the word Abba for God. Like
Uh-huh.
he calls him Daddy.
Yep.
Like it's not Father, it's Daddy.
Yeah.
And says because it's this really close, intimate relationship. And says on the other hand, when we're dealing with God, as close as it is, as loving as it is, um, it's also you're dealing with something that is so big and so mysterious that you can't really wrap your head around the whole of it.
Uh-huh.
That just because God knows you completely doesn't mean you can know God the same way. So there's a trust factor there that you have to trust that even as you share this intimate relationship with God, this loving relationship with God, you've got to also have the humility to say, but I really don't know you the same way you know me. I'm not going to. As the psalmist
Yeah.
says, your thoughts are too high. I can't grasp them. I can't wrap my head around them. All I can do is trust that based on the relationship we have, that the universe is unfolding in such a way as that it will be to the good of all of us. That is the intent anyway.
And be able to live with that trust.
Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful point to close this conversation for now. I'd love to continue it. Put two clergy together. We were just joking before this recording started. Put a number of clergy together, and it becomes a geek fest. But this is where we need to. This is where we need to stop. I think. Thank you so much for your insights, for your openness, and for the time you gave me for this conversation. I
Well,
enjoyed
I
it.
was going to say, well, thank you so much, Hubert. I enjoyed it as well, and I really appreciated the invitation.
You're very welcome. Bye bye, Sean.
Bye for now.